talk to you all today about Howard County's Green Infrastructure Network. I have to apologize, my smoke detector has literally just now decided to start beeping every minute and a half, so maybe that'll help with moving slides, I don't know. All right, so again, I'm Bill Mahoney with Howard County's Office of Community Sustainability. Community sustainability gets into a wide variety of different work areas. We get into agriculture, stormwater, we're doing some really exciting things with energy at the moment. I know that Lindsay DeMarzo from our office sent around some different materials to suggest that everybody look at before they come today. And I welcome you all to ask questions about those things at the end of the presentation if you'd like. I'm only going to be talking about Howard County's Green Infrastructure Network and some of the things that relate to that. But again, happy to talk about other aspects of what we do at the end of the presentation. So, what is a green infrastructure network? So the simplest way to think about this is it's a network of homes and roads for plants, wildlife, other species. It's all about connecting the county's very best habitat. So in this picture, all of the orange polygons, all the odd shapes in orange are our hubs. And these are our the best of the best ecological areas in the county. They are determined by scientific standards. Wildlife ecologists have ideas for minimum sizes that different land areas need to be to provide maximum benefit for wildlife. And I'll get a little bit more into that in a second. But again, this is so that species can move around the county. And why we would want that, why we value that, I hope will become clear as the presentation goes forward. I'd just like to say quickly that the state of Maryland has a similar map for the entire state that overlaps quite a bit with ours. And also surrounding counties, most of them have a similar system as well. And we try to connect our hubs and corridors to their hubs and corridors to have a larger regional impact. So hubs and corridors, again, hubs are our best big chunks of good forest, good wetland, et cetera, and they're in orange here. And the blackish brown streaks that connect those points are corridors. They need to be at least 300 feet wide to allow wildlife to move from one area to another. And that's not always true, but for wildlife to comfortably move from place to place, to move freely, they need at least that minimum. So since we're dealing with minimums and this map was mapped using GIS, it's going to leave some things out and it's going to include some things that maybe aren't that great. So if you live somewhere that isn't particularly even close to this green infrastructure network, or you don't live next to it, that's not to say that where you live is devoid of value from nature. It's not to say that you don't have amazing natural resources right by you. They just didn't meet the qualifications to get into this network. So having said that, to give you a little better idea of what we're talking about on the ground, here are some examples of our hubs and corridors. So Centennial Lake is a hub, it's a wetland hub. To be a wetland hub, you have to have at least 25 acres of wetland. We also have Lake Kittamakundi, we have Savage Park. Savage Park is a forest hub. Most of our hubs are forests, and to be a forest hub, you have to have at least 50 acres of what's known as interior forest. So interior forest is, if you have 50 acres, you need to have 300 feet of forest around that entire 50 acres. And those 300 feet are what make everything inside of it interior forest. And the importance of that will become a little bit clearer in a second here. But I just wanted you guys to see a little bit of what some of the connections are in Howard County in our network. We have Middle Patuxent Environmental Area over here on the left. Most of these corridors are streams, and that's why the network is what it is. These areas are already protected. They're largely parks and waterways that already enjoy some level of protection. So, right. So I mentioned interior forest a second ago. Why is it that that is the major building block of the green infrastructure network? So the reason is interior forest, it has higher biodiversity, right? A wider range of species, plants, animals, fungi, et cetera, everything. It has just a wider variety. And therefore, it can provide more services. All species provide some service to humans. So the more variety you have, the more services we get, You also have some insurance in that. If one species dies out, but there's another one that can take its place to perform those tasks, it's important to have that, that duplicate, that backup species, so to speak. So also, interior forests are more resilient to natural disasters and to pests, and some species simply cannot survive without interior forests. These 4 species here are examples of that. So we have a scarlet tanager up here at the top. They are moving through Howard County right now as we speak. This is a flying squirrel in the middle. A lot of people are shocked to find we have them in Howard County, but we absolutely do. There is a lot of magic to be found in our woods that people are, unaware of, and because some of these things are pretty sneaky. Black bear have been coming through Howard County the last several years. Certainly they historically lived here. And here we have a spotted salamander on the bottom left. None of these species can live without interior forests. They need it for at least some part of their life. Something very important to point out here is when you lose an interior forest, you don't just get that back in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. It takes quite a bit of time to develop that level of complexity in a forest to provide all the services that we get from it. Also important to point out again here is the idea of connectivity, which you'll hear me say probably too many times in this presentation, but our hubs, our great areas, Middle Patuxent area, the Patapsco, et cetera, if they aren't attached to one another in one way, they won't do well in the long run. They will slowly atrophy and fall to pieces. You can think about genetic decay being one issue, right? You can't stay breeding in the same 50-acre lot for too long before you start noticing problems with the species present there. Or if you lose a species in a certain area, if you don't have connections back to other areas with those species, you won't be getting them back for quite a while. So you can think of these hubs, if they are like islands, if you lose a species, you don't get it back very easily. If it's connected to other areas, you can get these things back more easily. So at this point, some of you are almost certainly asking, why do we care? This is great. I like butterflies. That's fantastic. But what's the big deal here? And basically what it comes down to is we all rely on what is known as ecosystem services. These are all the things that Mother Nature provides for us totally free and that we absolutely need as humans. So the general model looks something like this. If you just look at the sort of Venn diagram feature here, you have a natural asset, which would be a forest, a wetland, a meadow, and it may provide air purification, water filtration, or flood attenuation, or pollination, all these gradation words. And then the service or good you get at the end is something like clean water, higher crop yield on your farms, less flooding or smaller floods. So this is the general model we use when we think about the way that species impact us positively. And furthermore, when we try to replace these systems, the benefits we get from nature, it is always more expensive. So for example, we dredge our lakes in Colombia about every 3 years, and it costs about $1.5 million to do so. If you keep streams protected with good buffers, with forests, like our corridors and our hubs, that keeps soil held in the woods, in the streams, rather than flowing down into our lakes and ponds and causing us to then have to dredge those out later. Less expensive to preserve the original resource. Similarly, until 1987, farmers in Howard County were not bringing trucks of bees onto their property to help pollination. That's what this is a picture of. That's all beehives on a truck coming out to a farm. So at $50 to $75 an acre to pay for bees, this gets pretty expensive, especially if you're a small farmer. And this is a good time to point out that ecosystem services, when they start to fall apart, flooding, food provision, pollination, et cetera, when all the ways that nature protects us from these problems falls apart, people of lower income are always hit first. People who are tied to the land, like farmers, watermen, et cetera, they are always hit much harder and first by the loss of ecosystem services. So another example of how it's more expensive to try to replace clean environment than it is to just preserve it in the first place. This is a water filtration plant. You don't need to be able to read any of this, but on the left side, you have water coming in from something like Pretty Boy Reservoir, for example, where we get our water. Well, the fewer processes in the middle here, whether it's chemical or physical processes, that that water has to go through before it comes out clean on the bottom here, the cheaper the water is. So we get clean, cheaper water by protecting it in the first place at the source. And the best example of this is got to be New York City. Over 100 years, the New York City decided to buy some land up in the Catskill watershed that was protected, connected, big, beautiful forest. Looks a little bit like this. And what they decided to do was, we'll protect this area forever to supply New York City with water because we're running out of clean water down here. So they pipe it from 100 miles away, gravity driven, 95% gravity driven, under the Hudson and into New York City. And to this day, New York City has some of the cleanest, cheapest drinking water in the world. And again, it's because they protected a connected, large ecosystem. So that's a great example of how we can capitalize on the environment and what it does for us. Now, when we are unaware of what the environment does for us, we can make some pretty terrible mistakes sometimes. So about 65 years ago, the Chinese government decided that 4 pests were to be killed across China, every single one of each of these 4 pests. One was the Eurasian sparrow. They saw a sparrow eating grain. And they thought, whoa, whoa, that's cutting into our bottom line on the grain here. We got to kill all these sparrows. And they did kill all the sparrows. In fact, they ended up storming the Polish embassy to get the last of the sparrows, but they succeeded. So what they didn't know was that sparrows also eat the heck out of insects that prey on grain. So the sparrows were a net positive for pest control. This is widely regarded as contributing to at least 15 million deaths that happened during the Chinese famine. There were a number of other blunders that contributed to that, but destroying an entire bird population that is an important pest control species certainly contributed to a lot of death. So on the topic of pest control, Howard County, Maryland in general, we used to have a robust pest control guild. We had, that's a pine marten up here on the right. We had mountain lions, wolf, bear, many more, different types of weasel species, etc. These are helping to eat rats, mice, and deer, right? Deer have now gotten to a point where they are a pest, right? When anything gets out of control in its population, it can become a pest. So this is a little bit of a side story, but it's just fascinating to me. A study from the Carey Institute in New York found that they believe if we brought cougars back, that is mountain lions, back to the east coast of North America, to their former range, they would save 155 human lives, tens of thousands of injuries, and billions of dollars in community costs just by preying on deer. However, they would also eat 2 to 3 people during that same time frame. So this is like 152 person net positive, right? This seems like a win. Let's bring back mountain lions. Well, clearly there are major societal issues with bringing back mountain lions. I might be somewhat for it, but I'm kind of also not. I kind of like walking around the woods and not being scared of being, attacked by a mountain lion, which is really the only predator that ever lived around here that would actually do something like that. Anyhow, so the point is we have to pick our battles. We're not bringing mountain lions back. It's not going to happen. But there are other things that we can do. And so to illustrate that point, I want to talk about 2 specific species here. On the left, we have Japanese barberry. This is a terrible invasive plant that I grew up with in my front yard. It's available at every landscaping store around. Most of you have probably seen it. The problem with it is when it escapes from our yards and gets into the woods, it takes over and creates these dense monocultures, where it's just this plant. When that happens, it increases the incidence of Lyme disease bearing ticks by 7 to 10-fold. So if you go walking through an area of these plants in the woods, you have a 7 to 10 times greater chance of picking up a tick with Lyme disease than you would in a better bit of forest. So how does that relate to the Green Infrastructure Network? Well, as I said earlier, hubs are robust, strong, large ecological areas. They prevent pests and invasives from coming in due to their density, due to the fact that they are interior forest. They are slower to allow these things to spread through. So just preserving this interior forest slows the spread of some of these really negative invasive species. So, that's a call for preserving our hubs. Now, on a related note, these are possums on the right, quite adorable at their young age. They don't grow up to be quite so adorable usually, but they're really important. Possums can eat tens of thousands of ticks a year. It's hard to get a good number on exactly how many they eat, but they certainly eat thousands of ticks a year. So what challenges do possums face in a motor vehicle driven society? Well, they're evolved to freeze when they're scared. So if they're on the road and a car is coming and their decision is to hold still, that doesn't work out very well for them. And in fact, their populations are kind of dwindling. So what can we do to help animals like this that do a service for us, like pest control? One of the things Howard County is doing is we're looking at road crossing data, and we're trying to see where can wildlife get under the road rather than go over the road. Because when wildlife can go under the road, it will go under the road. And we see this with deer very often, raccoons, foxes, etc., possums. When things can go under the road, they will if you provide sufficient space. So if we improve our corridors, we could keep deer off the road a little bit, right? If they can get under the roads, that's safer for us. If possums, and again, these are just two species, but all the species that could move around instead of going over the roads, that's safer for us, it's safer for them, and they provide better for us as a result of that. So we need to protect our corridors and our hubs. So here's some, just to me, really good news, and I would talk about all the nuances of this slide for 2 days if I had the time, but Lodi Dam removal by DNR. This is an amazing project that is extremely relevant to connectivity. So on the bottom right here, we have rockfish, we have shad, which are also related to alewife and herring. These species can now all come up past this point in the Patapsco, as can the American eel. And this is important to, parts of the population that maybe aren't as affluent. There are people who would really like to be able to pick up a meal or two from nature once a week. Many of us probably here today are not in that desperate of a situation, but there are people in Howard County who are. So this connectivity, by breaching this dam, we're bringing many, many creatures back further up into the watershed. And my favorite example is this right here at the bottom, the American eel. These eels get way inland. Some of them make it all the way to North Dakota, actually, through tiny, tiny streams. The little streams in your neighborhood actually have these eels in them. You just generally never see them. On their way from the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, okay, they grow up, they're little babies in here. They go to the Atlantic Ocean, the dead middle of the ocean, and grow up in the Sargasso Sea. And then they come back into our streams as big adults. On the way up, they collect clams on their gills, little baby clams attached to their gills, and then the eel spreads them throughout the waterway. Well, clams are filter feeders, so they clean up our water, right? So all of this connectivity, you can see how it builds on itself. You're never just allowing one more species to get somewhere. It's a whole suite of species and the services that they provide to us. I also just like to point out, because people don't know, and I think it's a little bit magical for some folks, we have crabs in the Patapsco in Howard County, a little bit north of the Thomas Viaduct is the farthest north that I know them to be, but just a little, the more you know. So anyway, this is all fantastic news. This is a project by American Rivers and Maryland DNR. We have here a list of our 10-year goals. Really, the two that I want to talk about is that we have just recently updated our Forest Conservation Act. This just creates new forest protections and gives a greater level of respect to our green infrastructure network. We're also currently updating the Forest Conservation Manual, which helps guide developers to use best management practices when developing to best protect our environmental resources. We also concentrate as many projects as we can in the green infrastructure network. So if we're doing a tree planting or stream restoration, they'll get extra points as we rank them if they're in the green infrastructure network. So sometimes it feels to me like we're not doing enough, but we are steadily moving forward to protect our green infrastructure network. So what can you do as citizens? I know this is very important to all of you. And I think there's so much I could say, but the simplest thing is find the stories about nature that you're passionate about, you find very interesting, or an activity that you really like to do, and share it with children, with friends, people in your church, anyone who will listen, anyone who wants to enjoy it. Get them outside for some enjoyable experiences. We know very well that if people do not experience and engage in nature, they don't value it. And if they don't value it, they generally will not care to try to protect it. Specifically, there's myriad possibilities out there. You could work with the Conservancy, Howard County Conservancy, Howard Eco Works, Community Families in Nature. My office has plenty of things available to help get people involved. There's no shortage. So contact me, contact any of our great local resources, and we can put you in touch with something that is most appropriate for you if you want to get involved in some manner of environmental protection or science or something along those lines. Also, the government has tons of great incentive programs to help you pay for trees or maybe free trees or pay for half of a rain garden, etc. And we encourage you to take advantage of those opportunities as well. This is just a slide we have online available for sharing at any time, just a list of things you could do around your home. Again, we have myriad projects you could engage in. Building mason bee houses is a great activity with kids. It's adorable. Bees actually use these houses. And we have a lot more information online at livegreenhoward.com. So, in summary, it's hard sometimes to see exactly how it is that nature affects us. We know that we like to take a walk. We know that it brings our blood pressure down. It's good for our mental health to enjoy nature. But sometimes we don't really see all the exact ins and outs of how every single day it's supporting us. And our taxes would be much higher without cleaner water, et cetera, et cetera. So I just encourage you guys to look through a different lens sometimes at nature. It's not all birds and butterflies and fish, and I love all that stuff. But it's also finances, it's also practical, it's also good planning, it's also being good community members. So in short, protecting our green infrastructure network is like an insurance plan for our local environment, like keeping these areas all connected as we accidentally damage areas or a natural disaster occurs, we can recover better when all of our areas are connected. That's better for all of us. So I want to say thanks again to all of you, especially you who helped put today together, and everyone for being here, and also our great partners. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank Susan Overstreet in Planning and Zoning. She is a workhorse for Green Infrastructure Network. She did all the original mapping with Lindsay DeMarzo, who is also in my office now. They just do so much for this, and also Recreation and Parks, providing free trees to the community, helping us vet some of our ecological ideas, and all of our partners, EcoWorks, the Conservancy, et cetera. There are too many to name. So with that, I just want to say thank you, and I think it's a good time to open this up for questions.
Absolutely. And Bill, you've got a bunch. They started with, at the top of this, as you were presenting, there was a couple questions about, the lakes about being man-made. And then there was enough stream going on that they were answering kind of their own question, because yes, all lakes in Maryland are man-made, correct?
That is true. And particularly in Columbia, it's interesting because Jim Rouse was a genius. He realized that with all the development that would occur, you would need man-made lakes to serve as stormwater control and sediment ponds. So they're doing what they're supposed to be by collecting the sediment and keeping it going to the bay. It's just more expensive when we have to dredge them more frequently. But that is true. All lakes and ponds are man-made in Maryland.
Perfect. So now there's a number of comments about, there was a comment about, with the pandemic and people being home more wild animals seem to be venturing out and being seen, like bobcats in DC. And is there anything, that's a level of concern because of this? Should people be more careful going into parks and stuff like that?
I would say I really don't think so. You might see a little bit higher incidence of something like a bobcat or a bear, but really all of these species it's true, they are more scared of you than you are of them. So unless you surprise them, you're not going to have a problem. So if you're worried about it, what I do when I'm in bear country or mountain lion country, I sing the whole time I'm hiking, loud and obnoxiously, or I just say silly little riddles out loud. And my friends are annoyed at first, and then they get it, and they're like, all right, fine, keep doing it. We don't want to get eaten. So, but we're in Maryland. You know, it's not very likely. Just be loud if you're scared. You'll be fine.
So there is a question about the raising of bees. Do you need a license in Howard County to raise bees, or can I go out and get a hive and start raising bees tomorrow in my backyard?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, I cannot help you with that, but there is a Howard County Beekeeper Association that can help you with that.
There you go. Awesome. We will try to find that. Nicole or Karen, if you can jot down Howard County Beekeeper, and we will hunt that down to share with you guys tomorrow.
Also, Julie Costantino in my office is a great resource for all things pollinator related.
Okay, fantastic. Let's see. We've got a couple questions here. There's a lot of commentary about animals and stuff, but what resources can we access as a member of a homeowners association to perform in landscaping and ground maintenance? We want to keep the wildlife, avoid invasive plants, and encourage eco-friendly planting.
Right. So, sure. Homeowners associations can be tricky, obviously, right? They have different rules and what they allow. We can help you kind of on a personal level if you want to contact us, but also, I guess I would say broadly, there are homeowners guides. Many different nonprofits put them out, Chesapeake Bay Foundation, et cetera, and they'll just talk about all the different best management practices you can do around your home. And you'll kind of have to vet for yourself whether or not they fit in with your HOA. But we're willing to help you find something. I feel comfortable guaranteeing there's something you can do in your yard, regardless of your HOA. One that I always push is take 1 square yard, a 3 by 3 foot area, and put some native flowers or grasses in it. And that's it. That's a great introduction. Just start with that. It's easy. It'll take some weeding and some watering in the first couple years, but it's a great way to start. And then you're providing little pockets, little bits of habitat for things that are moving between locations in the green infrastructure network and other great areas. So,
awesome. So there's another question about, is fishing and crabbing permitted in any waterways in the county? And are there rules like for hunting?
Yes, absolutely. It is permitted. It's permitted much more frequently than it is prohibited. Nearly all the Patapsco River, most of our lakes in Columbia are fishable. There are regulations. You need a fishing license if you're older than 16, so check out Maryland DNR for that. It's not that expensive. I think might be $20 now for a year for freshwater. Yeah, so there are fees. There's also free fishing days. There are, I think, 3 days every summer that Maryland DNR says you can fish without a license. But for more information on that, check with Maryland DNR.
And I will share with you that I know that many of the ponds and lakes are stocked, because I've been responsible over the years for stocking the ones that are in my neighborhood. And DNR,
very cool.
Working with Howard County Recs and Parks to DNR, and so there's people out here fishing all the time.
Yeah,
another question. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Multiple bills and proposed legislation to do more to protect the environment. If there could only be one, which change would be the most important? If you know about all the bills that are out there right now, we're making an assumption.
Right,
that they are.
right. Of the current bills that are out there, I don't think it's appropriate for me to say which one I think is most important. But from my very biased position, I am very comfortable with saying that the passing of the new Forest Conservation Act was a landmark event for us. I mean, it was truly huge. We've been trying to do this for over 20 years, and we really expect it's going to give us much better results when we remediate from development processes moving forward.
Does the rooftop solar panel or other renewable energy installations have an impact on the ecosystem overall? And do they have an impact on our hubs?
They absolutely do have an impact overall. It's one of those things that's kind of harder to see because it's sort of a non-point source thing. But yeah, if you're using renewable energy, you're putting less carbon into the atmosphere. And that affects our waterways, that affects our trees, that affects many, many things. So yes, putting renewable energy of any form on your property is a benefit to the local environment, no matter how small it may be. A lot of people don't realize that atmospheric deposition of pollutants, so pollution in the air, just touching the water of the bay, I believe that's like 30% of bay nitrogen, I want to say nitrogen pollution, is just from the air touching the water. So yes, it absolutely does.
And we got time for this one more question, which is from Mike, which is impacts we are seeing to Howard County from invasive species, and how are we handling those, like snakeheads, giant hogweed, stink bugs, spotted lanternfly? Seems like ecosystems adapt, but are there other issues?
Yes, invasive species is just a fascinating but very, very tricky topic. There are many people who are moving towards an idea of saying, well, we just need to embrace a new world ecology and allow these things to invade. That's not the stance I take, but I have to admit, we can't address all invasive species. It literally is impossible. You don't have enough people, time, money to do it. And so we tend to prioritize them. Howard County Recreation and Parks generally prioritizes it by if it looks like it is having a major ecological impact to an area, then they address it. In general, there are different classes of invasive species, and we tend to take class 1 and 2 much more seriously. But the field is ever evolving. There's some really dark parts of it, but there's also some hope. We have some natural controls coming out for mile a minute, Japanese stiltgrass, some of the really voracious invasive species. There's starting to be hope for, but they are a major problem. Please remove invasives around your yard if you're able to identify them. You don't want to risk pulling out things that are actually native, but it's a great thing to do to remove invasives where you see them, if you know that that's what they are.
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. If everyone can give him a big virtual round of applause. Woo! Yay!
Thank you all very much. It's great to talk to y'all.
It's been great to have you here. We're going to make